Hello everyone, welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat, a podcast recorded on Darking John land by me, Liam Miller, he, him, his, a minister in the Uniting Church in Australia. I am very excited today. We're diving into a topic we've done a few times before, but always excited to return to it. We're talking abolition today, and I have Robyn Oxley joining us today. Robyn, welcome along.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's so good to have you. So for those who don't know, Robyn is a thorough woman and has family connections to Yorta Yorta. Robyn is an activist and lecturer at Western Sydney University in criminology. Her field is in the space of criminal justice system and Aboriginal rights to self-determination. Her work primarily focuses on human rights, social justice, systemic racism, prison abolition, defunding police, and improving outcomes of Aboriginal people in relation to the Australian legal system. So that's a bit of the broad overview that we're setting up, but I guess maybe just let's get to know you a bit more. Just where you're recording from today, because I mean you're obviously teaching somewhere near Western Sydney University. Though these days, I guess you don't necessarily have to be near a university to be teaching there.
Yeah, definitely. So like I said, my name is Robyn Oxley. I'm a Tharawal and Yorta Yorta woman. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and also the lands on which I'm speaking on, which is the Wurundjeri, part of the Kulin Nations here in Melbourne, in Naarm. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and know that I'm walking on their land very softly, and would like to recognise as well today that what we'll be talking about will be sensitive in nature. I'm sure some of it will be. So, just want to acknowledge that as well.
Yes, thank you for that. So, as we go into abolition, I guess one of the questions I have is, how did you come to this position, this idea? Because the reason I kind of reached out to you was I read a great piece that you wrote for Indigenous X, which we'll link below, about how prison and police abolition are not radical ideas. And it's a brilliant primer for anyone looking to kind of get to know this topic, or if you just want to, if you don't want to get dragged into a Facebook argument, you can just send a link which lays out a bunch of the really good, first steps in this kind of a conversation. So that's how I kind of thought to reach out to you to get you on the pod. But I'm interested, how did your journey with abolition, was it something you just kind of always were? Did you get convinced toward it at some point? What's your journey there a little bit?
So I guess my background with criminal justice in general is a lot different to what a non-Indigenous person's experience would be. And I think through that journey of youth and, growing up and into my early 20s, there's a perception that you get of police, and it's an emotional thing. So, my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, there's a history of colonisation and the impact that that's had, intergenerational trauma and so forth, kind of really sticks with how you interact with police and how you communicate with them or not communicate. In some instances, I remember my very first interaction with police was, I was around maybe 8 or 9, and a bunch of us were playing with water balloons. Like, it was a hot summer's day, and we had to fill up our water balloons, and we were running around trying to get each other with these water balloons, and a police car drove by and just saw a bunch of Aboriginal kids running, so they stopped their car and got out and chased us. We didn't know what was going on. We had no idea why they'd be chasing us, and I think from that moment I really looked at differently on how Australia's legal system treats Aboriginal people, and the policies and legislation that is enacted through Australian governments and successive governments and so forth. So when I got into my mid-20s, I was really interested in law, and I thought I would just, I'd never finished year 12, so I thought I'd just, go to uni, be a lawyer. Anyone can do that. But I did this bridging course or pathways into university, and criminology was one of my first units, and I was taught by the Dean of Arts at Monash University, Sharon Pickering, who was absolutely phenomenal and a big influencer in my decision to stay in criminology. And as I learned more about criminology and the study of crime and so forth, the words prison abolition started to surface through Dr. Bree Carlton, who was one of the lecturers at Monash. And I had never heard of it before, because there's just this over-reliance on prisons and this over-reliance on policing that, you know, we as society think that that's necessary and think that that's the only way, you know, to address crime, or to address, you know, crime is even a social construct, like it's an antisocial behaviour. So I looked into it more, and I read up about it more, and really admired what Angela Davis says about prison abolition. And, you know, it's not just the building that needs dismantling, it's the structures within those buildings. And I think my interactions with the criminal justice system as a young child and a teenager really shaped how I would go forward and I guess adopt that prison abolition standpoint, but more so about violence as well within those prison systems. And there's loads of things that happen within the four walls that no one likes to talk about. You know, there's lots of violence that occurs within the prisons. You know, there's language that's used around that. So there's a whole, it's like I said, it's not just the building that needs dismantling. It's so many different things within those structures and within the way we speak about people in prison, you know, within the way that we, that people are sentenced to prison, under what circumstances and so forth. So for me, there are other options to a prison, and, you know, quite frankly, like it's a business. It's part of the colonial systems, and, you know, everyone talks about the system being broken and so forth. It's not broken. It does exactly what it needs to do in order to run, you know, adequately, which is lock up people who, as Debbie Kilroy says, deemed as deficits in society. So rather than addressing certain behaviours through, you know, like a health response such as addiction or so forth, it's a punitive response. And that's I really like the idea of changing the narrative around that, and you know, getting people in society to have a look at what it means to, you know, abolish prisons and how we deal with those things as a health response or a social response rather than a punitive response.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Robyn. And I think, like, it is really important to, you know, for folks to realize that the difference of experience and, you know, attitudes towards police and prisoning, depending on if you're Indigenous or if you're a second person, particularly if you're a white guy like myself. It's like, and people have pointed this out, that, you know, for a lot of middle class to upper class white folks, we basically live in a world of police and prison abolition already, right? Like, you know, you have so little engagement with either. And you know, like I can think of, you know, plenty of times where I've done much more, you know, dodgy things than water balloon fights with groups of friends in public, and like either no repercussions or just this feeling of, look, even if something happens or we do get, you know, some attention from the police, it would be very quite easily handled and not become this big thing, you know. So that, like, you know, trying to, you know, locate and orient that shift, and the way, as I say, this goes all the way back to the very early, the whole process of targeting, of stopping, of who, you know, suspicion, and it leads into this whole system. So yeah, I think that's mightily important. I think also then, you know, you're talking about because I guess a lot of people will think about, you know, we do need prisons, right? You know, these are things that we just need because we're in the water of it. But I guess people have also pointed out in the kind of abolitionist discourse that prisons and in policing don't necessarily do the things you think they're doing, right? If you were to ask someone, average punter, like, what are the reasons we have prisons? And they listed their X amount of things. People point out, they actually don't do that. I'm interested in your perspective, you know, coming from criminology on that this divide, I guess, between what people think is being accomplished and whether it actually is.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to make. Particularly in Victoria, we've got the, you know, 1991 Sentencing Act, and under that Sentencing Act, there's 5 reasons to imprison someone, and it would be, you know, for punishment, for protection, so protect the community, to denounce the crime, to deter the crime, and to rehabilitate the person who has offended. And I really find them contradictory, these sentencing aims, because rehabilitation is one of the prime reasons why prisons exist. But it's a farce. It doesn't happen at all. In fact, the Andrews government a few years ago, I think it was 2018, injected a whole bunch of money into the prison system and the criminal justice system. And 2.3% of it, I think it was something over $1.3 billion, or don't quote me on that, but something very similar. And 2.3% of that went on rehabilitation. Now, if you're serious about rehabilitation being a sentencing aim, then much more money needs to go into that particular outcome. You want people to be rehabilitated. But it kind of it begs the question whether, you know, are we serious about rehabilitation? Are we serious about these sentencing aims? Do they need to be you know, re-established? We need to kind of unpack them and look at, you know, what it is we want from people who are in the system. But what is it that the system's doing to those people? That's the other question that, you know, we really need to be unpacking. And we really need to be looking at that when we're exploring, you know, the sentencing options. And, you know, if someone's imprisoned or arrested for homelessness, then why can't we address homelessness as a social issue, not a punitive measure? You know, what is it about that? Or, yeah, if someone, you know, is addicted to drugs, like, why is it always the go-to is punitive response? Why the go-to is always police? Someone has stolen something from your backyard, you ring police, right? It's well, why? What is it about that particular item or that particular area or that particular time? You know, time of year, time of day, whatever that's occurring. Like, is it, you know, is it youth that need more services to support them? Is it, you know, homelessness? They need more services. Like, what is it about it? Rather than just saying, oh, something's stolen, straight to police, how do we kind of, I don't know, unpack it a bit more and go, what is it about society that's making this happen? So I really kind of struggle with those sentencing aims, particularly in Victoria, but particularly rehabilitation in general across Australia, not just in Victoria. So,
yeah, I think that's so important too, because I think, you know, there we have this idea now that apparently the best way to rehabilitate someone is to isolate them from everyone who would be supporting them, who would be loving them, who would be reminding them of the person they could be, right? Like, and even the fact that, you know, we think of the geography of prisons is that they're never in a populated area. They're so far away, which can often make even visiting, you know, prohibitive for a lot of people. So, you know, and I think, like, and one of the reasons I think it's so important for Christians to be engaging with abolition, I mean, obviously everyone should be, but part of, you know, from my own background is, you know, Christians being a part of the structuring of prisons, partly as a reform to somewhat moderate, you know, to make it consistent out of punishment. But it's also got such a particularly maybe Western Christian logic of the way to rehabilitate and reform is to sit in a room by yourself, to think of what you have done, and allow the Spirit to stir you into proper action, which is just, you know, maybe that works for a handful of monks in one particular time and place, but not for the broad populace, and not for people from a very different cultural background. And I think it's just, you're right, that purported idea of rehabilitation, if we think that's what we want to do, I think there's just if that's really what you want out of what, you know, to help society, there's no real way to square that prisons as they are, or prisons at all, do that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I definitely resonate with the whole, you know, the time and date and who would benefit from, you know, sitting in a room reflecting on, you know, how you behaved, or what kind of, you know, actions you engaged in, and so yeah, I mean, you know, prisons are a Western system. They're a Western legal system. They're part of it. they were never part of, you know, Aboriginal culture for 60,000+ years. We never had. And I'm not saying that there were no problems. Of course, you know, of course there'd be problems, but the way to fix it is not to sit in a room isolated away from, you know, the very people that are there to support you and to help you through it and help you understand, you know, there are other ways, there are other, you know, support services to reach out to. So yeah, I really find that an interesting concept there that you've put through about, you know, time and place, and maybe in a Western sense, this was perfect 400 years ago, but, you know, we've progressed as a society, one would hope. So, you know, yeah, but the prison systems seem to be left behind there.
Yeah, 100%. And I think you're right. You pointed out, like, you know, it's not saying, and again, because this is a charge often can be leveled against abolitionists, is that there's a kind of a utopian belief in the you know, goodness of all people and that people left to their own devices. You know, but like abolitionists often, from my experience, have a greater desire, a greater emphasis on accountability than people who are just happy with a status quo prison system. Like, you know, there's like, you know, a lot of the alternatives that are offered are you know, rich in, this is how we, you know, accountability is key. People actually, you know, seeing and connecting with what they have done and why it was antisocial, connecting with why it has done harm, and then working through that, you know, is so essential. So can you talk to us a bit about how, you know, abolition does not mean anti-accountability, or whatever kind of phrase we're trying to.
Yeah, I think I'm huge on accountability. I think, you know, I think that's one of the main, I guess, things that are lacking within our Australian government is accountability and responsibility. So, you know, to be able to dismantle prisons and the systems that oppress, you know, the minorities in society. Yeah, it's not about, you know, someone breaking a law or breaking a rule and getting away with it. That's simply not what it's about. It's about why that law was broken, why that rule was broken, and how do we address that in a holistic way rather than just continuing to throw people, you know, in the system. Particularly when we move from, you know, when we move from youth into adults, it's just a recycled, you know, it's a recycled system of these youth that are just constantly in youth justice, and then, you know, eventually they just become in the adult system, and it's almost normal, and it's almost like, you know, we accept that as a society. But you know, once you're part of the system, it's very hard to break out of. So, you know, when we're looking at accountability and who's responsible, you know, my go-to is the system. Like, the system is responsible, and the system needs to take accountability for the laws that they're making, the way that policing is done, the policing methods, policing practices, racial profiling, and the racist legislation that we have in this country aimed towards, you know, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I'm talking about, you know, Victoria, 2019, I think it was, you know, we're supposed to abolish the public drunkenness laws or summary offence in this state, and we're still yet to do that. Now that's a law that impacts greatly on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and I'm sure, you know, as you mentioned, being a white man, if you're out drinking on a Friday or Saturday night, you would expect to come home safely, as should everyone. However, it's not the case with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and even during the day, as we saw with Arnie Tenny Day, you know, during the day, she unfortunately didn't make it home. So, you know, accountability works both ways. It's got to work within the system, and it's got to also work on individual and community.
Yes, that's a great point. I think, thank you for that. And I think, you know, that's something that, like, you know, I'm thinking of, you know, as again, talking about the, you know, who gets stopped and who gets arrested for what and various crimes. And that was obviously a thing that came with the landmark Royal Commission into Deaths in Custody was, you know, it's the whole thing. It's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are more likely to be stopped, more likely to be searched, more likely to be arrested, if arrested, charged, if charged, sentenced. if sentenced for longer. It's the whole thing. And then, as we've seen with that report, then once, and as you mentioned earlier, once inside those places, the possibility for violence is so much higher. The risk of violence and death is so much higher for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And so you've just got this whole thing that stretches the whole way. And as you say, once in it, it is so hard to break out because it impacts just everything, from people's kind of implicit biases towards who they can trust, toward the actual ability to access certain services or kinds of employment or types of housing, all those kind of things. And as you say, that the system has to be accountable for the violence it is bringing, and the destruction it is bringing on communities and families.
Yeah, definitely. I'd love to add to that as well. I spoke about sentencing aims, and one of them is punishment, and punishment is prison. But when you're in prison, you're continued to be punished, and in ways which people don't even recognise or would even realise. And it's interesting also to note that some people are in prison for years at a time, have never opened a door in that time, and then they're released into society and expected to assimilate back to what they knew before, but all of that's gone because of what they've experienced within those 4 wars. So it's, that's part of, that should be part of rehabilitation, but it's not. So many things that are missing, and that we expect so much of people when they leave prison, those expectations, and, when they don't adhere to that, how they feel about that. It's easy for society to stand back and judge and, but you have no idea what people are putting up with inside prisons, and especially because they're privatised. We talk about accountability and responsibility. Anything happens, who's accountable, who's responsible? Because it's not the government. They don't run these prisons, but then the prisons are there because of the government. It's just such a double-edged sword that, to and fro. It's like a tennis match, just, all this accountability and stuff just going to and from, and no one wants to own up to it, but are happy to continue these, policies and rules and regulations when it comes to putting people in prison and the continued punishment.
I think that's that point about, just what a huge adjustment it is if you've gone from not opening doors, not having to, order your own life. And then, even more extreme, you think of The Guardian ran a piece just recently, which was looking at a particular story of one Indigenous youth in detention and talking about the 23 hours a day in solitary confinement for days on end, absolute, awful, inhumane, disgusting treatment. But if we've often, a lot of people have, joked or talked about COVID and what lockdown has done to our psyches, and how we're not ready to go back to putting on jeans after being in sweatpants for months and on end, or what it's done to us to be inside. That's inside, our homes, where we still have a great deal of autonomy and Netflix and, everything like that. But even we, through this season, through this year, have, felt that to some small extent. And then, so you say, extrapolate that out and then be like, okay, now let's go back and function, please, with the eye of suspicion and we're waiting for you to mess up hovering over that shoulder.
Yeah, I get really annoyed when people compare COVID lockdowns and curfews and so forth to being in prison. Obviously, they've never been in prison, so otherwise they wouldn't have made that comment to start with. But you're not strip searched, for starters, when you're in your own home. You get to have access to internet, to the outside world, even though it's via video. You're not told when you sleep, when you wake up, when you eat, what you eat. There's there's liberties that you have that we all had during COVID lockdown, and we all endured it. But it's completely different to prison. There's no comparison. There is absolutely zero comparison. So when, it really frustrates me when people compare COVID lockdown to a prison.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's, So, thank you for that. It's so important. I think another thing so I was reading a book review you wrote for the International Journal of Crime, Justice and Social Democracy on Blagg and Anthony's Decolonizing Criminology. And one of the things we were talking about there was, there was a kind of a comment within the book about those who go into prison for kind of a relief from, be it homelessness or family violence or different things like this. And you rightly criticize the way that is referenced in the book. And I think that's a good way into thinking about two kind of things here. One, that talk that you were saying before, that, how much is lacking in terms of the preemptiveness, in terms of actually addressing the issues that are leading people toward incarceration, or and and also then the fact, and I think this is again a thing that surprises a lot of people, is why so many people are actually in prison. Like, how many people are in prison for unpaid parking fines or unpaid fines of various types, and they just can't make bond, which is, deeply, again, a classist kind of approach to how we think of who can be in and out of prison, or for various other reasons. So I guess, that's something I'd just be interested to talk about, both in terms of, what leads a lot of people to prison, because I think then you think, well, actually, a lot of that, the preemptiveness is quite straightforward in some sense. The social and communal steps we can take are straightforward.
Yeah, I think that was a really interesting concept. I think that shouldn't actually, well, it actually should be in the book, but it needed to be unpacked more. So the idea that Aboriginal women prefer to be in jail than in their family homes is what might be real for some people, but without giving it any substance, it's absurd. The reason why they're unsafe in their own home is because there's family violence, because there's, it's unsafe for them to be there. It's unsafe for them to be in prison. However, out of the two places that they can go, they're both unsafe. Which one's, less unsafe? And, unfortunately, prison wins in that respect. So why is it that they only have a family home that's unsafe or a prison that's unsafe? Why can't there be another option for women who are experiencing family violence to go? Why aren't we addressing the way that men are brutal and are violent towards women? Why isn't that being addressed? Why is it always the woman that has to be remove herself from her home in order to be safe? And particularly being put into a system that, they won't get out of. They will continue to just be part of the cycle. And it's a lot of it it's got a lot to do with colonization and the impacts of colonization. And I say that simply with this, there's these social constructs of Aboriginality that exist, that, we're inherently criminal, or we're alcoholics, or, we sniff petrol, and, all of these things, that these stereotypes that are constantly thrown at us. But even if you look at it and you say, yes, there is petrol sniffing happening, yes, there is alcoholism, yes, there is drug use, yes, there's violence. It's in every community. It's not just Aboriginal communities. However, when we look at Aboriginal communities, the reason why these things happen is because of colonisation. So we've had child removal, we've had forced assimilation, we've had dispossession from land. All of these things have never been addressed, and the truth has never come out about it. No one in the Australian government is willing to provide compensation for these people who have been forcibly removed, dispossessed, and so forth. Even generations down the track, it's still trauma that exists after each generation. So the intergenerational trauma. So we have these issues and impacts of colonisation. Alcohol was introduced to Australia. It wasn't here beforehand, and was used to pay for, as rations for work being done rather than money. But no one talks about that side of things. Women had their children removed from them. Communities were massacred. We had the frontier wars. Like, so many things happened in our history of 230 years that still continue to this day. Like, it hasn't stopped. And this is why I also had a bit of an issue with the decolonising. I mean, it's really difficult to decolonise a system that's entrenched with colonisation and colonial settler ideologies of what law should be, and so forth. So yeah, I think when we unpack why these things occur and why people drink, or why, what is it that they're trying to escape from, or why do they not feel safe in their own homes? Like, there's a lot more to it than just going, oh, you know what, I can either pick being at home or I can pick being in prison. Yeah, I'll just go to prison because it's safer, because it's just simply not the case.
No. Thank you for that. I think that's such an important to place this within that ongoing colonial violence, ongoing colonial project of white supremacy, and because I think we often see people who've been kind of come to abolition from maybe an American system, might have read like a Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow, or read Angela Davis, who you've mentioned before, who are placing the current prison industrial complex in the US as this is just an extension of Jim Crow, of slavery. It's just the newest form of white on black violence, on structural and systemic racism. And I think sometimes, like a lot of times when Australians, we look at the US and go, yeah, boy, the US, pretty bad. Good thing we don't have anything like that here. But, as you're saying, the prisons are very much still an extension of the same settler colonial project, the same colonial violence of removal from families, of, the taking of land, of the restriction of flourishing, of the taking of wages, all these kind of things. So, which then we should push to, there's a lot of folks out there who maybe are generally warm to the idea of we need to be doing work on the impacts ongoing of colonialism and that, but have not taken that step to see that prisons and policing are the heart, or so central to that. But if you want to be a part of one, this is part of that movement.
Definitely. And I think, another part of colonization is the idea of, forcibly removing and dispossessing Aboriginal people from their homelands and from their country. And then they want to be connected and stay connected. So they go back on country, but then, they're arrested for trespassing. That adds to that disproportionate number of Aboriginal people in prisons. In a country where sovereignty is never ceded, how do you trespass on your own land? How do you get arrested for that? So, it's all these things that have happened. That's just a small snippet, but people would be like, yeah, actually, that does sound crazy. How can you be arrested for trespassing on your own country? Like, yeah. So, I find that I don't know. There's lots that we need to unpack and unpick and talk about, and there's loads of truth telling that needs to happen. And you know what? No matter how uncomfortable the conversations are, it's not comfortable for us either. But we're willing to share this knowledge and share the feelings and move forward together.
Absolutely, and I think that's where things can be fruitful as we look to move forward. Is so obviously the system now absolutely is disproportionately focused on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And on top of that, also, loads of families in different communities have had their lives and their families and their communities torn apart by prisons and policing. And as you say, prisons are not something, they're a new concept, particularly on these lands now known as Australia. So for those families who have felt that, and again, that's, impacts different communities, particularly other marginalized groups more than others, but, who are thinking oh man, what if our son who, when they were overdosed, woke up in a hospital with, a handcuff around their wrist? What if they hadn't? What if they hadn't? And maybe they wouldn't have gone and overdosed again, and then died. What if, and that's where the fruit can come of actually learning from, sitting and listening to, Indigenous peoples and going do you know other ways? Are there other ways that we can learn and listen from so that we can all heal and all have, try to work out ways that we can eliminate or reduce antisocial behavior in a way that does not tear us asunder and ruin lives and wreak violence wherever it goes.
Yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, absolutely. But I think like I said, there's this over-reliance on the criminal justice system here in Australia. And I'm not just talking about, the courts and corrections, it's policing as well. Like they're a huge part of the problem, like massive part of the problem. And some people will argue, oh, well, we'll just get Aboriginal people in the blue uniform. That doesn't actually help. It just pits Aboriginal people up against each other, because whether you're trying to change the system from within or change it from the outside, you can't change a system. Like there's no reform with the criminal justice system. There will be no reform with policing, but you cannot reform such a violent system that continues to oppress. So, yeah, I really kind of struggle. I love that idea that, if unfortunately, if you had a family member that OD'd and they woke up without cuffs on, and actually we looked at that as a health response. I love the fact that if you've got, a kid that's kicked in the door, you'll ring someone to fix the door, not police. Like, I like the idea that we change the way that we think about things, and we change the way that we address that kind of behaviour. And rather than relying on police all the time, I really, really hope that, in the future we have less, we focus less on prisons and punishment and policing, and look more towards, how we deal with it socially.
Totally. And then even we've seen one of the great shames of the last year was how readily accepted it was that police needed to be an essential part of COVID management, right? Okay, how are we going to manage COVID and ensuring people behave in a way that's safe and et cetera, et cetera. And we're like, well, we'll turn to the police. And it's like, that seems fraud. And unfortunately it was like, accepted, I think, far too easily from people like, across a pretty wide political spectrum. And I think, it's the same with, people have talked about before with, the reliance on police on mental health call outs and checks, who've done maybe a day of specified training on how to deal with mental health, which, compared to, hey, maybe we could get someone whose whole profession it is to de-escalate and to work with someone in that situation and to bring everyone out, because there are people who do that all the time and do it well. So yeah, I think you're right. It's thinking of who, what do we think is the best person to go to in this? It might not necessarily be who we've always been thinking is the necessary person to call.
Yeah, and who we've been told, I guess, as society, we're told that, police are there to help. I'm not sure who they're there to help. I'm pretty sure it's the colonial systems that they've come from. But yeah, I think, COVID was a perfect example. Rather than, handing out fines, they could have handed out, face masks. There's one way of, preventing probably a whole heap of people who would be, not able to pay that fine, and then it, progresses and gets bigger, and before you know it, they're in prison for, not having a face mask. Well, hand one out to start with, you won't have the issue.
Yes.
But police brutality through COVID was just, it was extreme in itself. Particularly towards Aboriginal people. And I think in that article that you mentioned, that I wrote, I did mention a few cases in that one of, what happened with, with police brutality and violence, and why we then look towards defunding police, because, it seems to be okay to take money out of health services or education or housing or employment. That seems to not, no one bats an eyelid when that happens. But as soon as anyone, thinks about taking money out of criminal justice system, then it's like clutch the pearls, can't let that happen. What would happen if that money actually went into services that address these issues to start with?
Absolutely. And because that's the thing people point out, the money is there. It can just be redistributed. And needs to be done so, obviously, in conversation with those most currently adversely impacted by the system. But it absolutely could be done.
Yeah,
as you say. I think that's very helpful. And I guess one of the, you've kind of pointed out a few times. So you're down in Victoria, and a lot of stuff under the Andrews government. Sometimes people might when you go into abolition talk, people, you know, kind of see it as like, oh, you're being partisan or things like that. It's like, no, because this is a topic that absolutely defies both major parties. You know, like this is so they're not going to find you a home there. It's you know, which is in some ways perhaps means you can build a whole new broad tent of people who can get involved in this work, but at the same time also must feel very disheartening because you're like, we don't even, you know, there's no, you know, group close to the current power system that you can feel like you've got an ally in this work.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think we'll make our own power. I think we really rely on grassroots campaigning, like, you know, such as Clean Out Prison, which was a campaign last year to try and get people out of prison who weren't there for violent offences during COVID, because it was a breeding ground. It was just like waiting. It was a ticking time bomb waiting to just explode. So, you know, as we saw in America's prisons, it just absolutely wiped out, you know, so many people. So the threat that would happen in Australia was, you know, was confronting for families who have people in prison. So yeah, you know, we there's a lot that we rely on Aboriginal community controlled organisations such as JITA. We've got NATSILS, which is the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Legal Service, run by Roxy Moore, who's an amazing lawyer, Aboriginal lawyer. We've got VALS, which is the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service. So there's loads of, you know, Aboriginal community controlled organisations that, you know, it's not, I guess the power is different. Yes, there's government who makes these, you know, legislations and policies, but without our voice, you know, without our actions and campaigning, then, you know, who knows what the future of prisons.
Yes. Thank you for shouting out those groups. I think that's really important. And I think, you know, and I've seen other, you know, things set up, which are just like simply like putting in for bail funds just to get people, you know, it's a really direct way. You can just get someone out tomorrow because the only reason they're there is because they don't have the money, which again, as we've talked about earlier, is just so absurd and disgusting. Robyn, thank you so much for today. It's been just a truly wonderful conversation. I hope everyone who's been listening along or watching along has appreciated and learned from it and is going to check out some of those organisations you talked about and look at how they can get involved and support. Anything else you want to shout out, or how can people connect with your work, or you got a course coming up that you want to tell people to enroll in? I don't know. What do you want to shout out right now?
Yeah, I mean, I'm teaching gender violence and crime this semester in Western Sydney Uni, and I also teach First Nations and criminal justice in the second semester. So very interesting topics. We don't hold off on you know, getting down and getting dirty in the impacts of colonisation. We'll talk about all those things. But you can follow me on Twitter, which is Robyn_Oxley. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
That's great. Thank you so much for joining us today, and hopefully we'll connect again down the line.
Absolutely. Thanks, Liam.